Listening, fill in the blanks.
Let's start.
Activists in other countries say they too want the United States to play a more leading role on the noise issue. But as in other areas of environmental health, merely having a more powerful government agency in place that can set more regulations is not the ultimate answer, according to other experts. Bronsaft stresses that governments worldwide need to increase funding for noise research and do a better job coordinating their noise pollution efforts so they can establish health and environmental policies based on solid scientific research. Governments have a responsibility to protect their citizens by curbing noise pollution, she says.
Throughout the Bronze Age, 2400 to 750 BC, people were cutting down trees more than ever before, until the prevalence of the practice, coppicing, peaked, likely at some point during the early Iron Age. Oliver Rackham, 1990, theorizes that nearly 50% of land throughout England was no longer wildwood by 500 BC. Their growth from a stump grows more readily than the original tree, and Neolithic man had discovered this practice, known as coppicing. Much of the remaining woods were maintained by way of this method during the Bronze Age. Fossils of thylacines dating from about almost 12 million years ago have been dug up at various places in Victoria, South Australia and Western Australia. They were widespread in Australia 7,000 years ago, but have probably been extinct on the continent for 2,000 years ago. This is believed to be because of the introduction of dingoes around 8,000 years ago. Because of disease, thylacine numbers may have been declining in Tasmania at the time of European settlement 200 years ago, but the decline was certainly accelerated by the new arrivals.
The idea that a person's character can be glimpsed in their face dates back to the ancient Greeks. It was most famously popularized in the late 18th century by the Swiss poet Johann Lavater, whose ideas became a talking point in intellectual circles. In Darwin's day, they were more or less taken as given. It wasn't after the subject became associated with phrenology, which fell into disrepute in the late 19th century, that physiognomy was written off as pseudoscience.
There is another theory that recalls the old parental warning not to pull faces because they might freeze that way. According to this theory, our personality molds the way our faces look. It is supported by a study 2 decades ago which found that angry old people tend to look cross even when asked to strike a neutral expression. A lifetime of scowling, grumpiness and grimaces seem to have left its mark.
The principle behind the fuel cell is simple. Hydrogen and oxygen, two of the most common elements in the world, are a very explosive combination, but separate them with a sophisticated platinum-coated barrier, and an electrochemical reaction takes place, where positively charged hydrogen ions react with oxygen and leave the hydrogen electrons behind. It is this reaction, the excess electrons on one side of the barrier and the deficit of electrons on the other, that creates electrical energy.
The finest pigment available to medieval artists was ultramarine, which began to appear in Western art in the 13th century. It was made from the blue mineral lapis lazuli, of which only one source was known, the remote mines of Badakhshan, now in Afghanistan. In addition to the difficulty of transporting the mineral over such distances, making the pigment was a tremendously laborious business. Lapis lazuli turns grayish when powdered because of impurities in the mineral. To extract the pure blue pigment, the powder has to be mixed to a dough with wax and kneaded repeatedly in water.
The first known European women in the Pacific came with a doomed colonizing venture which sailed from Peru in 1595 under the command of Spanish Captain Mendana. However, it is unlikely the Ruamahanga skull originated from this expedition because no evidence of Mendana's ships has ever been found in New Zealand, while a team of archaeologists working in the Solomon Islands in 1970 did discover the remains of European vessels dating from the 16th century.
Talking on the phone while driving isn't the only situation where we're worse at multitasking than we might like to think we are. New studies have identified a bottleneck in our brains that some say means we are fundamentally incapable of true multitasking. If experimental findings reflect real-world performance, people who think they are multitasking are probably just underperforming in all, or at best, all but one of their parallel pursuits. Practice might improve your performance, but you will never be as good as when focusing on one task at a time.
The Samii is taking place on a much grander scale in Austria, in one of Europe's largest river. Restorations to date. Engineers are regenerating floodplains along 60 kilometers of the river Orave as it exits the Alps. They are also widening the river bed and channeling it back into abandoned meanders, oxbow lakes and backwaters overhung with willows. The engineers calculate that the restored floodplain can now store up to 10 million cubic meters of floodwaters and slow storm surges coming out of the Alps by more than an hour, protecting towns as far downstream as Slovenia and Croatia.
Like, share, subscribe the channel and press the bell icon for further